Thank you, friend. Shabbat Shalom, and a wonderful summer solstice to all. Isn't it wonderful, simply wonderful, that just about every week we get to celebrate something? Now, unfortunately, for whatever reason, last week just wasn't as popular a show. The viewership was down, so let's try and make this one a little bit more appealing. I'm sure you're already aware that one of the oldest religious symbols we know is a circle with a cross inside it, like an ancient version of a Celtic cross. And the circle represented the path of the sun over the course of a year. And the cross marked 4 key dates, the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices. The equinoxes, of course, celebrate the 2 most important holy days in the Jewish calendar, as they mark the ancient first day of the year. On a solar basis, that would be March 20th. That signified the date on which you could begin to create the year you wanted, and which marked the countdown to Passover, 2 weeks later, the most important holy day in the Torah. The festival of unleavened bread that commemorates freedom. And then September 22nd, which was the first day of the 7th month, which came to be known as Rosh Hashanah, now known as the High Holy Days, and which subsequently became the first day of the calendar year. An equinox, of course, is equal light and equal dark, and these were the 2 equinoxes, and that alone has amazing significance on both a personal and a cosmic level. Now, this weekend marks the summer solstice, one of the 4 days, the longest day in the northern hemisphere's year. Solstice is Latin for sun standing still, because that's kind of how it appears. Friends, almost all cultures see their holidays built around these 4 dates. And the twin festivals of light occur during the winter solstice. Now, I hope you all made some sacred time and space for yourselves last week, friends. But remember, we talked about how the Torah exists on multiple levels or dimensions, and you could take the literal meaning or the allegorical or mystical meanings. We saw someone who contravened the law of sacred time and sacred space and died for it. For some, they read it as God killed him for picking up wood. Others will see the story as a warning that if you don't take the time to recharge, you will die. Some people spend their entire lives reading and believing only the literal meaning. They don't go past the do no work, and may actually not even connect to the concept of sacred time and sacred space. Their reason is that's the rule. Now, they're not wrong, just as those who see this only at different levels and take the message to be of connecting to the universal oneness of singularity and recharging their essence in their own personal observance of sacred time and space are also not wrong. We need to see it's really the same, only vibrating at different speeds, like the colors of the spectrum or the rainbow, all one energy, but at differing speeds. And that is reinforced with one of the rebellions that we're about to talk about. Now, you may have noticed that there's certain recurrent themes, and among them are freedom, sanctity of space and time, protection of widows, orphans, and children, and all-inclusiveness, one law for alien and for resident. And you will see some of those again in this Parsha. But before I talk about that, I want to point out one of the amazing things about this technological shrinking world we live in. It really is a global village now. When I grew up in the late 50s and 60s, your friends were pretty well determined by where you lived, and were restricted to the kids on your street. In high school, it expanded, but not by that much. Now you can have friends anywhere, some of whom you've never met. We have a friend who I have never met who lives in California near San Francisco. He was forwarded our show several months ago, and he enjoys it and watches it every week. And he writes to let me know his interests and the topics he'd like to see covered, and just to say when they have special meaning for him and how much he enjoys them. Well, he's undergoing radiation therapy. So let's all pray for Bob and his 40-day journey across the wilderness. Mishaberach Avotenu. Makor Habracha Lemotenu. May the source of strength who blessed the ones before us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing and bless those in need of healing. Thank you. Now, from what was actually called the Beatles, but which everyone called the Double White Album, came these words. You say you want a revolution. Well, we all want to change the world. Friends, that of course came from Revolution number 1, not the other numbered Revolution song, which most people probably just skipped over on that side of the album. And this week we see revolution. Korach. Korah. This is the story of a rebellion, which is revolution spelt by the side in power. And in this parsha, we see the revolt and grumbling, which began earlier, come to a head. It talks of the rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and how after it was thwarted, God confirmed Aaron and the priesthood via the miraculous blooming of Aaron's staff, which may have been the precursor to Joseph of Arimathea's thorn staff in Glastonbury, which blooms every Christmas. And it put in place further priestly rules and Levitical privileges, but not before all the conspirators and 14,700 of their followers were killed. And so this, my friends, is another of those parshas that sometimes make people believe there is a different God of the Old Testament than of the New, a God who is angry, vengeful, wrathful, petulant, and jealous. But as I said before, there is only one God. And above all else, he is the God of the Maimonidean attributes as expounded in Exodus 34:6, slow to anger, governed by mercy, and by which it is said, he governs the world. Now, when I read this parsha, I'm immediately taken back to Edward G. Robinson and the Ten Commandments. And I think we all remember when the Israelites are in the desert and the rebellion is brewing. And he says, where can I bring you except to Egypt? And an Israelite says, where there is death? And he responds, no, where there's food. And he then directs Aaron to make the golden calf. And so the rebellion begins. But it actually begins with Korah. He was the cousin of Aaron and Moses. He has 250 men with him. And he says that if all the people are holy, he has as much right to the priesthood as Aaron does. And so we are about to find out that there are degrees of holiness. And it's like telling your kids that they're grown up. And they want all the grown-up rights, but they're not always ready. They still have to develop. And this rebellion is really about the same thing. Yes, God said that everyone was holy, but some are readier than others for certain rules. It doesn't mean the others won't develop, but it's not automatic. How many times have you judged someone comparing their current actual to their potential? And you hope they continue to develop and reach. In Numbers 16:5, Moses sets up a test of who is holy in which God will choose. It will be a decision as to who is holy in a priestly sense, as opposed to being holy as a people observing holiness in a general way, like the multiple ways of reading the Torah, my friends. And this test will be via the use of incense, because only the holy, the priests, are permitted to burn it. And this will become a permanent part of the priestly role. Now, this was brilliant on Moses' part. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was an order. And he gives 4 orders in a row. Do, take, put, set. It wasn't up for debate. This is something anyone undertaking the role of priest would have to do. And so Korah can't refuse. And at the same time, Korah and his group know the significance of incense because they witnessed and know that Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, died from such an offering. Now, I don't want to leave you in suspense, so know that they were all incinerated. And their incense pans were then gathered and used as plating for the altar, because those objects became holy. You say you got a real solution. Well, you know, we'd all love to see the plan. Now, at the same time, the story of Korah was interrupted by another. There was a second rebellious group, led by Dathan and Abiram. And friends, this has always been a bit of a problem for biblical scholars. 2 rebellions have been combined. One of Levites, with Korah's group challenging Aaron for priestly privilege, and one of Reubenites, with Dathan and Abiram challenging Moses for political power. Church and state, my friends, and they actually take place in 2 different places of confrontation. And in an amazing fashion, the political rebels accuse Moses of taking them from a land of milk and honey. Well, once again, God threatens to kill everyone. Moses pleads for the people, just like Abraham's pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah. And in fact, Moses uses the same words as in that story when he tells the people to move away or else you'll be annihilated. And the ground opens up and swallows them. And then, unlike in an earthquake, the ground then closes again. But friends, It's not just the rebels, it's their entire families and possessions. We have a difficult time understanding the concepts of ritual, sacred realms, purity, impurity, violation of sacred zones. The biblical age was different. Today, we may feel guilt for things that we do via contact, such as knocking a holy book off a shelf and having it hit the floor, something done quite accidentally. But the guilt we feel over things would be magnified 1,000-fold when God was closer and in their midst. And when all is said and done, as I said, God kills 14,700 people that day. We read this and we have a hard time understanding it. We don't connect to that level of sacredness. As much as we'd like to, we don't understand everything. I remember in the first episode of that great show, Mr. Ed, with the talking horse, when Wilbur expressed an inability to understand Ed being able to talk, and Ed offers the show's only comments on the subject. Don't try, he says. It's bigger than both of us. Friends, some things are bigger than both of us, and sometimes it's all too much. It's all too much for me to see the love that's shining all around here. The more I learn, the less I know. But what I do is all too much. But when we read this parsha, certain things are understandable. The death of Korach and the budding of Aaron's staff mark the end of the battle for priesthood. It established that only Aaron's bloodline will have that role. Now, we talked last time about the blending of the Torah into the book we now know and how it ended up with 2 creation stories and 2 Noah's Ark highlights. And here, 2 rebellions become merged. And they actually have 2 conclusions for 2 different stories, but they still emphasize one thing. Only certain people can enter sacred zones. And now we see that God speaks to Aaron alone, further cementing the priestly role for his heirs. And I wonder if this is the real purpose, the establishment of the right of the church and who will govern it. Unlike the state, which will change with the handover to Joshua, the church goes to the heir of Aaron in perpetuity. And in a small, almost throwaway line, we get a much better understanding as to what Holy of Holies means. It's a term that we've encountered since the wilderness journey began, right after the Exodus. And while I think most people immediately think of the spot near the western wall when the temple existed, the second temple that is, as the place where the ark stood, it's actually not one spot. It never was. You see, friends, it changed depending on where they were and what was being talked about, be it the ark or the place of sacrifice. And what it really meant was in the holiest of holy conditions. Well, we all have holy conditions in our lives. And those 2 change. Yes, we ultimately carry our holiest place in our hearts, but we don't always see it there. Where's your Holy of Holies? Do you honor it? If you could, what changes would you make? I always think of that great line from the Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys. If you had just a minute to breathe and they granted you one final wish, would you ask for something like another chance? This whole part of the Torah, my friends, is about the journey. Remember, the desert wilderness is a transient space. It's not a place which can be settled or cultivated. We pass through the desert on our way to our permanent destination, whether physically or internally in our hearts and spirits. Life in the desert is also transient. It is preparation towards a desired objective. Even the holiness in the desert was temporary. Mount Sinai was sanctified for the sake of the Torah's revelation, after which it reverted back to its prior state as a mountain. Permanent holiness cannot be found in transient places, either internally or externally. But we still must uphold all those key principles: mercy, kindness, protection, freedom, singularity. And friends, we as a group still carry an amazing legacy from the days of Abraham. Be our guest, put our service to the test. We don't turn people away, whether we are in the desert or not. The Torah, my friends, is about sanctity, and that comes in 2 dimensions: the dimension of space and the dimension of time. And we've talked about sacred space and sacred time, and we will again. And we see space has varying degrees of permanence, be it the desert, the sanctuary, the temple, our own places, our own spaces. And so, my friends, this time we talk to the idea of Sabbath transcending the realm of man because it belongs to the realm of creation. It belongs to the sacred and is not part of the temporal realm of the desert with its transient sacred spaces. The fire pans of those who perished were considered holy because they were carried into sacred space even by non-holy people. It was the space that made it holy. And we have seen that levels of holiness were spatially restricted. These twin rebellions mark a borderline between the sacred and the profane, church and state, and they too serve to remind us that only the consecrated can cross into the zone of the sacred. We have to focus on the enduring and the eternal and not mistake the way station for the final destination. Truth, honor, love should be our guideposts. We have lost sight of truth and light as the rallying cry of today's religion has become pay, pray, obey. Thank you for joining me, friends. Shabbat Shalom, and have a wonderful week.